This video is a tutorial for how to open AutoCAD 2013 for the Mac. It is very similar to AutoCAD on the PC. The tutorial is meant to sort of go through the process of the first time using AutoCAD after you've downloaded on your machine, and then we'll actually walk through opening a drawing template, and then from there also inputting a plot style, a CTB file. Again, this is very similar to what's going on in the PC side, but it's for AutoCAD 2013, the Mac. After you've installed AutoCAD and gone ahead and activated everything and plugged in the serial codes that you receive via email for the student version, you just click on the icon or run it through your applications. As the file loads, you'll see a prompt for an educational product drawing. By default, this piece says it's not an educational product drawing, this initial template file. That's just due to the fact that it's AutoCAD's native template for all their products. You are using an educational piece, but it's just letting you know that this drawing was not originally a template created by an educational product. You just click Continue. And as the program continues to load, by default, you come up with an interface that is showing you a black screen, the sort of model space view, if you will, and what we're looking at right now in the interface is actually the sort of raw file that comes, or the raw file that opens the default piece, hence the sort of drawing one. If I kept going over here to File, New Drawing, it would create it drawing 2, 3, and so forth. So one of the first things we want to do is sort of look at the template itself. And over here is a properties inspector. Depending on what defaults are on, that piece may be missing. And so what you do to bring it back is you can actually type in properties, and you begin to see, as you see down here in the command line, these various pieces. As I type in PR, and it starts to autocomplete things for me to find. And I can select properties, and you see it pop up over here. This piece is very important to have open at all times, just to sort of navigate between certain elements and sort of see things from its color and all these other information that runs through when you begin to deal with text bases, and then of course the plot styles and these other pieces, which will become more important as you move through certain elements in your architecture career, less important for this particular tutorial. Over on the other side is actually your standard icon tool palette, and with that icon tool palette you'll see things that actually, when you hover over, will actually let you know what each tool or icon is part of. If you see an arrow in the bottom right corner, that means there's a flyout. And just like other products, Photoshop and other elements that Adobe has created, those sort of nested elements allow you to grab more specific versions of that tool, variations on that tool, and so on. So simple things like undo and redo, target points, and then the sort of shapes from line, arcs, polylines, and splines, which we'll go over, and then of course the sort of shapes themselves of the circle, rectangle, ellipse, and then these sort of hatch pieces. These become more important during editing moments like trimming, copying, and pasting certain things, and that will again be addressed in another element of the tutorial. So when you first open up the software itself, now that you're looking at the default settings, you can go in and actually take and change your preferences. And so in the preferences element, you actually go in, and what you see is something in both the PC and the Mac program. They're pretty similar. The PC has a few more bells and whistles, but it actually overall is quite an equal product on both platforms, either the Mac or the PC. Again, he's here as these sort of general elements that you can take on. What you have over here is the autosave. You can shorten this down to as short as 1 minute, and it can go up as almost an infinite amount of minutes for autosave. I recommend autosave being on, but also giving yourself the ability to potentially go back. So somewhere in the 5 to 10 minute range is actually quite a good use of the actual tool itself. And autosave is exactly how it sounds. The file continues to save to a backup file, and then that would allow you to recover data in case the program was to crash. And I just want to stop here for a second and remind anyone looking at this tutorial, if it's your first time using this program, AutoCAD is no different than any other program, stable or unstable. they can still crash, literally disappear. AutoCAD is a very, very high end on the side of stability, especially the Mac has made great leaps and bounds over the past few years, and I would, again, trust in it, its ability to perform, but that scenario, it can still happen, hence the autosave. Over here, you have a thing as calling quick click secondary click as a return key. So this is talking about the right click button. So I keep this enabled. And then you can even, for those of you who have used the PC more predominantly or enjoy this particular tool, you can reverse the zoom direction. And if you don't know what this means, don't worry about checking it. For those of you who do like to sort of change the zoom direction, in other words, what Apple has done over the years, more recently is transitioned to a different way to scroll, literally zooming in the opposite direction. This can bring it back to what was existing. I would keep it unclicked due to the regular environment in the Mac that already exists. Enable spacebar to hold and pan. Again, a really nice shortcut to understand, which we'll get to. Display viewport controls, keeping that on, very, very helpful. Create new viewports in layouts. Show page setup manager, not a necessity, but again, you can start to play with these things. This sort of defaults work out quite well. And then you actually look at something like the cursor in selection is the idea that you can actually use the shift key to add selections. So again, the idea, depending on what you'd like to use for the interface, this makes perfect sense if you've ever played with selecting things in multiples, is that you can use the shift key to actually add groupings to things. AutoCAD also has a way to sort of, similar to the Illustrator environment with vectors, sort of selecting groups at a time by sweeping view windows. Click and drag to start selection. You have these things about grips, again, sort of showing you where endpoints or key points on a line are. I would actually keep those both on. I do not think any of you will need to be using blocks anytime soon, but I would keep both of these on. And now you can play with things simple as the sort of crosshair lines length. This is the extension that acts like your Mayline board, so the idea that you're going to allow the point in space to move. If you go to 100%, and now I'll click OK and go out, you start to see it as it moves the entire screen like you're moving your Mayline up and down on your drafting board, and you actually start to see the actual element track vertically and horizontal across. So again, going back up here into preferences, we can go back and change that to 50% or in some variation of. I will keep it so it doesn't go to the full extent, just so you can see the difference. That is completely user preference based. And then these pieces here, I sort of keep them at the default. Again, you can be able to sort of play around with these elements as necessary, but I think their defaults actually work out quite well for this purposes. Units and guides. When you open a drawing and how it begins to sort of go through and how you interact with it, the source content being inches is very important, and the target drawing in inches is very important. And the idea that you can actually auto-track things as well. So actually you can see as the input you're playing with simply from a start point to an end, these things become more apparent. The look and feel, the only thing you really on this piece want to look at is model space is by default what they call a slate. It's basically a black, a dark blue, as you probably notice on your screen, and paper space is white. I think these are very good defaults to actually continue with. Again, you can begin to manipulate these pieces as necessary. And then this application settings you will not have to go into for this course and how you're starting to play with sort of fundamentals, but these elements have default paths that will take advantage of the defaults, but you can actually become more sophisticated across them. And then again, this element here in documents and settings, you don't have to worry about actually interfacing with any of those defaults. So again, as you work back, the general, the cursor selection, units and guides, and the look and feel. Those elements are things that you actually can play with subtle nuances and also going back sort of play with that sort of system. So now that we can click OK, we can also talk about the idea of how I got there. As I go back and we saw through the drop-down menu, I can go through preferences. I can also, through the command line down in the bottom corner, you can also pull it out if you need to, down in the bottom corner, I can type in PREF, and you start to see the piece actually fly up and down, and I can grab preferences. And I'm back in this sort of display. AutoCAD is very kind to key commands, and you'll begin to notice certain ones and play with certain shortcuts. And that's a really distinct feature from some of the more icon-based elements or programs you might be used to, especially in the world of the iPhone and iPad. The icon-based elements, we actually can take advantage of what your left hand is doing while your mouse is navigating. So as you see, as I'm moving the mouse across, it's just like Illustrator or Photoshop or any other program. It starts to track with the center point being where the actual mouse is driving from. But if I scroll, I can actually pull in and pull out. So I should say, I'm sorry, zooming in now, or pulling out, exactly like you scroll on other programs. So I'm taking advantage of the scroll wheel itself. The middle mouse button, if you have a middle mouse button, by depressing it, you can actually pan. And panning again by just depressing it. So the same with the sort of interactive scroll wheel middle button, you can pan. You can also pan by just depressing the spacebar. So again, I'm depressed the spacebar, then I'm moving up and down, right, left, and that sort of element across. And then the sort of other pieces that happen with zooming and in and zooming out, you can begin to interface with the actual zoom menu, which again we'll get into when we look at an actual drawing file. But that sort of zoom piece, again, typing in Z, it allows us a factor of zooming in different ways, different elements to actually get a hold of different elements in the template. Down here along the bottom is another set of defaults that you can set. So do you want to display a grid? Most times it's actually not necessary for how we sort of move, because you can actually create your own grid or other series of layers. And so I actually would just uncheck that most times. You can of course set the grid size if you want to get into, but unchecking that. You can snap to things. Again, I would keep those pieces actually turned off. You have an ortho mode, which we'll get into when we draw. You have a polar tracking mode. You have an object snap. So again, these pieces might be turned on and turned off, the actual ortho and polar here and there. I would keep object snap on. By right-clicking, you can see what elements you want to auto-snap to. Again, notice endpoint, midpoint, center, intersection, and actually extension can be deselected. And now if you start to see these other things of extension, insertion, perpendicular, tangent, nearest, these will become more apparent about what you might do with these other auto elements, but I think keeping on these particular four are a great default to start with. And then as you look through here, you have object snap tracking, which again, you can start to see what happens when that turns on and off when we get into drafting. Dynamic input, I would keep that off. Showing and hiding line weight, I think again, virtually showing line weight can be quite confusing and help muddy. It can really muddy a drawing. So again, unchecking that, and transparency itself, which is something you won't get into in CAD, really doesn't matter. We won't actually be using that in our course this semester. So what I'm going to do now is actually close the drawing file that came up natively, and AutoCAD sees any change you make as something that might be worth saving. So when I hit close, it actually asks me, alert, you have done something that might want to be saved. I don't need to save, but this warning will come up in any file that you have manipulated since its last save. So now as we go into the actual navigating through the template, you can actually open up and see that on my desktop I have saved down the CTB file and the template file. So the template file is dated for 2013, August 21st, and so is the CTB file. If we update these files at any point during the semester or next semester, you just will be told which file is the most current. So as of right now, this is the most current file. So I'm going to open up the template, and I'm going to have a special thing in my template, which is actually an element of that's in Paperspace, which we'll get to. You will not have this particular part of the file. You'll instead just have these lines, which we'll talk about. But also, I can now begin to put in our particular CTB file, which is the line weight associations file for the course. So if I go into the File menu and go down to Plot Styles, I actually, by AutoCAD's design, it takes me right to where its Plot Styles folder is. So I'm going to double click on it, and you see these are all the default AutoCAD line weights except for these two. These are actually for my particular professional use, so that's why you're seeing those. The rest of these are probably in your file by default. Again, I've highlighted the two that are not going to be in your particular root directory, but neither way, that does not necessarily impact you. Just wanted to show you that addition. And I'm just going to take our CTB file and perform a simple drag and drop. I can also copy, paste, so if we wanted to actually copy that particular file, but instead I'm just going to drag this piece into the file. So now that is in AutoCAD's plot style directory so that it can find it across. So as I go back into the template, one of the things you notice is, as I said, we'll get to this particular one about how to read a drawing or how this piece works in just a moment. What I'm going to show you is this is what you'll be seeing. You'll be seeing a series of lines that starts from red, yellow, green, blue, and purple, magenta, however you want to call that, and then white. And then down below, you'll see a faint red, a sort of medium grain red, and then a brighter sort of pink red element. And the same thing goes for grays. A fainter gray, a medium gray, and a very, very bright gray. So as I look at those files, that's actually every line type that can be plotted from our CTB file. And it goes from thinnest black line to thickest black line, thinnest red line to thickest red line, thinnest gray line to thickest gray line. And you'll notice that the reason why we set these up are for simple nuances in your drawing, allow you to sort of vary across and sort of set up, but also to sort of begin to create a legibility in a system for you to see subtlety. So I'm going to zoom out now and show you an example file that I've set up for us to, in the end, plot and look at as we complete the tutorial, just to show you what you're sort of reading. If you've never seen or interacted with CAD before, this will look like a sort of a rainbow spectrum of line work that actually probably means next to nothing. But at the same time, if you begin to follow certain visual codes, which you will pick up quite quick as you begin to see the line weight types, is that you'll find out that this magenta line is thick, and it's our second thickest line, and it's actually what I'm using to cut through the walls. This is a window, and it's sort of sill, another part of the wall, the window, the other part of the wall, and so on. And then our thinnest black line is this red. This red here is defining an edge to a lawn. This is actually a lawn, what you're looking at here, this element here, a curb. This is a staircase that comes out of the other building across the way. These are the sort of thickened walls of a garden that you're going into this courtyard. And as you come in, you can see that I've also created this sort of axial relationship to see the sort of symmetry that's set up on the facade in terms of its axial relationship. This is our red line, one of our red line types that would actually plot red. So again, that's red in both the drawing and in the reality of the plot. These are actually all codes to say different thicknesses. Again, this is a gray type, and so what you actually end up with is sort of code system where you can begin to read this just like your line weights at your desk when you were drafting last year. And then extruded above it is actually an elevation set. And you see this elevation section piece where I've got the ground line is our thickest line, the white, which is actually our thickest line. Cuts across, cuts through the wall, the garden, and then out. And then these elevations of these masonry walls, they're columbaria walls actually for this project. And then this sort of relationship of the wall to wall, and then this open element, which is a bench and a trellis you're seeing in elevation. And then the windows of this building behind. So I'm actually looking with a section cut through this red line, if you will. I'm actually looking at that section, that sort of element across. So you can begin to pick up on this language as you start to draw, and you become much more competent, for those of you who have not used CAD before, like I said, to actually begin to visually read what sort of thicknesses you're providing in the sort of real world. Now that being said, this drawing is also different than the drawing on your desk because it's drawn one-to-one. And so this element here is actually drawn where if I was to do the distance, which is DI, brings up the distance tool, and that's literally the distance between one point and another. If I do the distance from here to here, I actually will begin to get, or I would get a distance, an actual length of that element in the real world. These are real lines. So again, this distance to here is actually setting it up so I can begin to, again, what I'll do is, I'll break this out for you here so you can see. Sorry about that. So if I do a distance piece again, you're seeing the sort of input. I'm going to go distance from this line to this line, and it's telling me it's a distance of 1 foot, which is actually the thickness of this wall in reality. So you have this virtual space that is almost, for lack of a better term, infinite, right? This is actually infinite space. I can keep drawing, keep going from this building to how it sits in the city. I can draw an elevation over here in a section. I can draw a detail of just how this wall meets the ground. I can draw the detail of that over here. It can all exist in this world at one-to-one scale. And then I choose, when I go into my particular paper space, which we'll get to, about what scale I want to plot it to for the actual analog, or let's just say for the actual creation of a drawing that I want to present at a scale other than just the sort of virtual world I'm in right now. So as we go back through and sort of see like the drawing from that language, what you notice is something like this arc that's inscribed right across this light pattern here, which is a paving change within the actual garden element. This is a fountain piece that's actually the focal point of this this sort of language within this project. And then this is a bench that sits above the grass. So this is a planter. This is a planter. This is the groundscape, so hence the threshold there. But then this bench is above this planter, therefore the yellow line associated with it. We'll talk more as we get into sort of fine grains as to why these pieces here actually have variations of yellow, or the yellow, but just varying thicknesses to achieve what might be glass at this scale with the window itself. We'll talk more about that later, but I think it's important that you sort of begin to visualize that sort of piece. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to delete this because this is something you will not be using right now in your own work, but you begin to sort of see the language, is that you start to zoom in, and now you can see when we look at these lines now with a coding, if I go in and now type in the sort of layer management tool, and this piece, so LAY began to pull this up, but there it is, there's various layer commands, but we just want the layer dialog box, and here's our layer set over here. And so this piece, which I'll pull out, show our layer list, and now what I can do is actually start to engage this drawing. What I'll do is I'll actually pull it out of the way so you can see the properties dialog, which is important, is that you see everything from our layer 1, thickness 2, thickness 3, thickness 4, thickness 5, and thickness 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Again, thinnest is 1, thickest is 6. Gray, 1, 2, 3. So 1, 2, 3. Red, 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. And now you have layer control across this. So I can double click and access a layer this way. So what I'll do is I can draw a line that's red. And again, you go over here to line, or you type in line. But you also see that there's some parentheses across things, right? So if I start to play with L, the L, there's an LI for list. There's also straight up L is actually the command for line. You can type in line, click this, but again, I encourage you to continue to explore your text-based commands, your key commands, because it's that much smoother, sort of quicker. So as I locate a point, you see that this ortho tracking is on that we talked about in the original file that we opened up. I have this ortho tracking on down here, and that's exactly how it sounds. It's orthographically locking things. So as I move across, the line can only go horizontal or directly vertical. Again, just like your mainline edge and a 90-degree edge of your triangle when drafting. And you see that also the distance is growing. And so what I can do is from this side is I can actually say I'm going to go at a particular line. So I can just actually say, and I'm going to go at and draw 3, 3, which is 3 inches up and 3 inches over, and I get this line. And you see as I can zoom in again infinitely here, one level. Zooming in, I get a 45-degree line that was 3 inches over and 3 inches up. That at can be very helpful if you know exactly where your point is. But depending on what you want to do, it actually might be quite frustrating to sort of play off of that sort of system because you don't necessarily know exactly what that point is. So again, you can, using tool palettes, go to the eraser, or you can just type in erase, as you see down here, or you can just go back. It's as simple as the command E. E is the shortcut command for erase. And instead, now I can go back to my line and actually draw this line and set up, instead knowing that I want to go over, let's say this time I'm going to go over 36 inches. Okay, and again, down here you can see the prompt that's being entered. 36 inches. That just drew a 36-inch line. I also could say, again, starting another line, I can say I'm going to go over 3, and then using the single hash mark of the sort of single quote mark, I can do 3 feet. And again, it responds to that as well. By default, AutoCAD's going to assume, because we went in our preferences file and said inches, assume that every number you enter is by default inches. You do not have to ever use the double quote in that scenario. But again, I could have. Here we go through a line. 36, and again, inches. I can use the actual inch mark. That is redundant and not necessary, but again, achieves the same thing because our native units are inches. So again, this is all real-world dimensions. That's actually a 3-foot line. That is a 36-inch line. Those are all lines that way. Again, I'm going to hit E in the command for erase, and then you hit Enter to actually confirm. Right-click to enter. We set that up. So again, right-clicking or just hitting the Enter key. In the purposes of AutoCAD, when you're not in a command, remember the thing I set up was actually that pan was with the space bar. When you're actually in a command, like line, as I start to draw using my left hand, or my left click to enter that point, I now can type in 36 and hit the space bar as well. The space bar is also an enter when you're in an active command. So again, that's something you'll begin to pick up, and you see why, due to a lot of the pieces you're doing are dealing with your left hand command itself. So as we look at this particular piece of drawing, you now have these layer pieces, the layer elements that are set up. You also have 2 other layers we haven't talked about: layer 0 and layer non-plot. Layer 0 is by default the AutoCAD native layer. It does not want to delete that. AutoCAD uses that as a base thing. You never have to engage that layer. It by default is set up as white and comes in that way. You never have to use that layer, and we don't have it set up to be anything for a layer type that you use as in the sort of command setup, but that's by default native. Everything else is designed specifically for how we are going to interface with the computer. This non-plot layer is something that I wanted to actually talk about discretely, and that is, again, if I draw a line and I go across, and as you see, it's now not ended, right? As I've done left click, and I move across, and then I hit Enter or right click, whichever one you want to do, to end that line. I've created this cyan line, and for our purposes, cyan will mean non-plot. Similar to Photoshop, InDesign, and Illustrator, like a guideline, you can use it for exactly that purpose. And you can even go so far as to, after you've set up guidelines, as you see over here in the layer box, there's pieces of this asterisk to freeze it, but also on to lock and unlock. You can actually lock that layer. So now that layer, as you see, it's sort of got grayed out there. Even though I can select it, as again, as I'm sort of making this window box, going from this direction allows me to select anything that it touches. I actually cannot delete it because it's in lock mode. I actually cannot delete it, but it allows it to be there. Conversely, if I go the other way, the non-dashed box that you're seeing is going from upper left corner to bottom right for a pick box. Again, that's just the general selection tool. that will only grab things that are fully encapsulated in the window. So again, this direction versus that direction. So I'm going to go ahead and unlock. I'm going to erase, but now you know that cyan, the only other layer we have on here with the non-plot, cyan will mean guideline or line that will not show up in the plot style that's set up. So as you start to look at that, you now have the sort of tool set. You noticed I created a line, I'll go back here, that is that shape. Well, I also can go up and actually up here, you notice when we were hovering over earlier, I have polyline and spline. So if I look at polyline, a polyline, I can actually set up and go and do something similar. And I enter out. That element is actually all one unit, hence the polyline is sort of more than one. Right? This sort of element it has more than one line that's made up across it. Again, the mnemonic in there, the title in there about the P line itself in command, or the poly in front of the line talks about that language. The same, relatively the same looking element that I drew with just the line tool, that is just a series of individuated lines. So again, you should start to see that sort of language across. So as we look at this on a certain level, we actually can see the difference between those two. And then the only other element that we need to sort of draw attention to in this process is actually the spline. So the spline itself is a pretty straightforward tool because it's actually going to ask you, specify the first point, and then it's going to ask for the next point. And again, these sort of interfaces that always happen down here in CAD, it asks you what it wants to do next, right? So this is the history in the command window. This is what's going on right now. And then you see as I start to move this element, it's starting to create sort of curvature that was inferring key intersecting points or nodes that exist at those points I selected, but it's not tracing that line exactly, but rather creating a curvature that blends all the elements across and through. So this is how contours can be made. This is how sort of gestural elements that come through based on manipulation of certain things that you're trying to get after in drawing and diagram. But you see that sort of piece had a similar set of point sets, but it actually is radically different due to its attempt to constantly blend a curvature across. It's a very interesting tool, and it's actually something that Nick can unpack in a more detailed way as you get into upper level courses. For our elements right now in Studio, we're going to be asking you to use it, if you do, with the sort of restraints of understanding the way the nodes and their sort of curvature connectedness unfold. So with that element, you start to see those sort of three ways of drawing the line set that result in radically different ways to either interface, again, the polyline being all together, the line being, although being connected, they're actually individuated segments, and then the actual spline itself relying on those particular nodes, but actually creating different points. So I'm going to again now erase these guys. So you go back. So you just want to now sort of look at these line works and say that you do not have to draw the beauty of CAD in any one particular pen to utilize that pen. You can actually start by doing all your drawing in an actual language that is a similar layer type. But I can go back through my layer tool and my management tool and actually select this particular line, and going up here I can change my layer interface. Again, here's the properties inspector. I can change my layer to layer 1. And that's all you want to manipulate right now is actually your layer type. And again, my layer can be layer 2. So let's say I want this to be our thinnest black line, thickest, but maybe I want these two lines to be a medium gray. So I'm going to go to gray 2. And let's say this particular line was a very important emphatic gesture, so I might go to 6, and that's my thickest line, sort of go across. So you can always check on your layer by selecting it and seeing what it says over in the Properties Inspector itself. But hopefully the visual cues will continue to sort of refine themselves and sort of set up. But that element right there is actually set for a particular sort of purpose, sort of diagrammatic purpose. And now I can isolate those pieces without going through. So again, this palette. The only other way to go about this makes sense is I'm actually going to go back and undo. So U being undo or going through and setting up this way, right? So I can go back to all my cyan. Is I can actually match properties to particular things. And that is simple as saying M, and certainly the first thing is M is move is the shortcut. MA is this match prop. And so you can go MA and enter. And now I could instead say I want to match the properties. First ask me what's the actual property you want. And now with this sort of paintbrush icon, I can say I want to match the property, that red line, to this particular drawing. So I can actually use that together. And I actually maybe want this guy to also be red. So again, right-click, customization allows you to bring up another command, the same command back. You can also go back over here and go to your base palette, and much like a painter selecting elements in the brush, but instead if I made a mistake, like that I didn't want this to be the yellow layer, but rather green, or later on I decide I want it to be green, I can actually go over and bring that back. It's green, and maybe I want this to be thick, and we'll use what we had before, the sort of thickest set. So as you start to see this condition, you actually really begin to sort of grab a hold of the idea or the concept of why the sort of virtual world is wildly different than the analog world when it comes to this sort of drafting set, because of what you can manipulate and remanipulate across. And there's a series of whole other tools that start to play across that element. So I think that's a really important piece to sort of set up across that sort of space itself. So now that you sort of see this tool palette, you can again, really realize the sort of arsenal of things available to you differently than just your pencil on your drafting board itself. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to close and not save this file. Okay, that's my purposes. You guys, of course, would be saving and using different things across. You can save as, just like other programs. We're actually not going to save. So I'm going to reopen the file one more time here, to actually talk about what you saw in the beginning. So what you actually saw with this particular paper space element. So this is paper space, and what we saw over here with sort of paper space is as a sort of example or a way to sort of read a drawing type. And so if I look at in your template, you're going to have an 11 by 17 and a 24 by 36. For the purposes right now where you are, you're going to use only 11 by 17. We'll talk more about the 24 by 36 in class when we get up to larger scale plots. This is just for printing using the sort of laser printers that at school as well. So as I go and select my 11 by 17, you'll see that what I've set up for you in this condition is actually a series of grid lines. And again, sorry for the contrast, low contrast in this sense, but it's just like Photoshop. Grid lines that help organize how you want to lay out your viewport. And by default, I've given you one viewport. And so let me just deselect things. So again, here's my cross window, right? I actually know I have a viewport under here, so my cross window selected both the viewport and this guideline. So I'm going to deselect it by holding down the Shift key. And you see what I'm doing is I'm actually manipulating this particular piece. So again, now that you sort of see that I began to pull this viewport, let me just step back out and actually erase those guidelines, because I don't need them right now. You can actually take advantage of those as you're laying out your own. But for me, I actually need this thing to be pretty much as wide as the paper. And as Monica shows in her tutorial for the print lab, these offsets are important. You're seeing the margins of the printer with the dash line, but the actual size of the sheet of paper is here. So again, anything that ends up outside this dash line will not print. But as I now look at this particular piece, I can now go back, and for our purposes, actually, I'm just going to do a quick cleanup and actually erase, again, typing in E in the shortcuts. I'm going to erase those template lines that you'll have in your particular piece, but instead I'm going to go back out and actually go into the actual print. So with the file print idea, I can go down and do file print or Command P, Control P if you're on the PC, but file print. And with file print now, this very simple interface for our purposes shows up. And with this, you have ways to talk about what to print. And right now I have it set up that it's a tabloid, which is 11 by 17 inches, at landscape. That is correct. That is how we're going through. The printer, right now you're seeing my printer at home, not important because your printer on the Mac side, you can actually disregard whatever that is because you're just going to save as a PDF. If you're on the PC side, you can actually use the printer, the integrated Adobe PDF print option. So again, the printer option would be a PDF and you just print away. We're going to be at 1:1 scale and we're going to be printing the layout. That's how you guys are going to play around with this. Like I said, we'll eventually get to actually just saving as a PDF in a second. So as I go back out here, one of the things I gave by default is the viewport has a certain property. So for our purposes right now, I'm just going to fully expand properties. And as you see, as I've selected this viewport, you see that it's set to a scale of 1/8 inch equals a foot. That's actually the scale I want to print this drawing at. You can choose anything from the default, or sorry, there's something as large as 1:1 to the sort of 6 inches equals a foot, sort of that comes natively with CAD. 100:1 scale, these are ratios. For architectural purposes, you know, we'll camp out in here, somewhere between probably 32nd and a half this semester was where we'll probably be, somewhere in between those, that spectrum. But it's important to note the scale because you'll have to label that scale for your purposes of communication. You have to sort of take note of that. You can communicate with figures in space, of course, the sort of scale figures I have here, but it's important to know that condition. And then as you go up here to sort of scale to fit, which is exactly how it sounds, it would actually scale to the window. So that's going to fit as you see the entire file. But again, I'm going to go back and I'm actually going to do 1/8. There are ways to do custom scales. Again, for our purposes this semester, you won't need to. And I can enter paper space, or enter model space, I'm sorry, by left-clicking double left click at any point, and I'm actually in the actual model space of the project itself. Very often you'll have to use this to actually pan around and locate the file within it. So now I've sort of situated this on the page the way I want it. I release my pan, and then all you have to do is either type in PS for paper space to bring it back out, or just double-click outside of the frame. And now you actually have this thing at 1/8 scale ready to plot. So the viewport itself is on our non-plot layer, so it actually won't print that box, which is quite convenient and an important thing for this because I don't need the bounding box to be some driver. But I can always create another viewport by typing in MV for make view or M view, however you want it to be. So make view is MV, M view, so you're making a viewport. And as you see, as I can create, just drawing across, another viewport within. We'll talk about this more as we come into the other parts of the semester, but for this particular product right now, I only need to print one viewport. You may actually arrange multiple. Like we said, you can use your grid lines or some sort of guide scenario to actually locate how you want to create multiple viewports across a page. For our purposes, again, in this tutorial, I'm only going to use one, but you can create multiple, just like you create multiple InDesign placed files, and you can control each one of those scales separately. So I'm going to go back to File Print, and one of the things we can look at here in the page setup to show you is by default, our template file is looking for this plot style. So depending on how your interface goes, you may look like this. You may show up with this particular element. AutoCAD and a lot of Mac programs show that there's more options by showing this little play button down here, sort of flyout button, and that sends out, and it's looking for a particular plot style table. If this is not showing up, you probably should go back to our first step of plugging back in that CTV file, but it should be able to find it. From the pull-down menu, you see all of our plot styles that were in that root folder I copied into when we first started the tutorial. So I'm going to choose the file that's appropriate. Again, by default, it's set up. Print with plot styles checked. That is correct. And again, this printer less important for you guys because you actually do not need to be using the printer directly on the Mac side, but on the PC side, your printer would be, you'd be printing to Adobe PDF if you need to use that. Click OK. Now I'm back to my print dialog box, and now I'm going to save as a PDF. And to save as a PDF, right, just like other programs on the Mac, it just moves through this element, so I'm going to set up. And for, again, our purposes, I'm going to actually save to the desktop, and I'm going to call this my test plot, and I'm actually going to use the date. And now I've got this element on the desktop, and I'm going to save it to for our purposes. Again, title and author, not important. It's actually just the title of the file that you need. You don't need any of this to be changed. I'm going to save it. It starts spooling, and now I've created an actual PDF file from this using that plot style table. So I'm going to hide AutoCAD, and I'm going to go back, and the last piece of this tutorial is actually to show you what happens to this PDF. I'm going to double click. My default viewer, and most of the default viewers on the Mac, is the actual preview thing. The same thing would happen in Acrobat. You notice AutoCAD creates a digital watermark that then shows up physically. Hence that sort of warning we get when we first open AutoCAD. This is letting us know that we're using an educational product. Not a problem, but also not attractive for what you're doing. So I'm going to show you how to remove that last step here. But now you start to see a properly line-weighted drawing. The walls are thicker because they're cut through. The windows are thinner, but still allow some sort of reading of the sort of glass container. The lightest lines for the sort of paving system are the light gray. The fountain kind of terraces up at you, sort of moving through its larger basin, or its basin that's the highest. The edges of the planter, the bench wall, and then in elevation, again, the sort of pieces that are sort of set up across. So I'm now going to just quit preview and actually open this particular PDF in Illustrator. So now as I open in Illustrator, because it's a vector file, I'm going to do one step and one step only in Illustrator of actually removing that particular file. So depending on what Illustrator you have, you may see a slightly different, obviously, opening to this, but the tools are identical in CS5, CS6, and then Creative Cloud. But now as this particular drawing loads, I'm going to see everything I saw in preview, except I'm actually going to be able to control what vectors I'm selecting, unlike in preview. So let me just zoom out here. And all I want to do is select the text of that, just verify what you're doing, and hit delete. Select the text over here and hit delete. And actually what you noticed, by the way, is it deleted that piece. They're actually all related as frames. I actually deleted the one over here. Again, select again. Just be careful you're selecting individually and on that text. Do not select elsewhere because this drawing actually has a lot of nested things within it, just by the way AutoCAD creates the PDF. And now again, I'm going to delete that. And I've deleted 4 items, just the one step of deleting those 4 items. And I'm just going to file, and I'm actually going to save again, right? So I'm actually just going to file save across that element, where I actually just save the file. Oh, apologize. So now I'm actually going to save the file. And now I've got an element that I can quit. And if I go back to my test plot, let's say I'm getting ready to now bring this over to one of the computers at school to do an actual print of this. Now I've got a nice clean PDF. As you can see, I've got a nice clean PDF edge across. And you've now successfully navigated from the opening of our template, the creation of your particular diagrams, the viewport and its scale, and now you actually have the ability to read and sort of see a properly weighted, from thick to thin, grays, reds, drawing type. And again, just to reiterate, this is about practice and trial and error and pieces that you want to sort of get at the sort of nuances yourself. Ask your classmates questions who have experience with AutoCAD. Certainly searching on a particular problem you have is important, but I really want to encourage you to not just take one thing or one issue at its sort of face, but actually sort of investigate different ways to solve problems, different ways to create drawings, and most importantly, truly experiment with the sort of infinite amount of options and elements you can get through. And we will go over any other questions and unpack the sort of larger sort of tool sets as the semester goes on. But I think it's important that you guys continue to explore the sort of nature of this new virtual drawing world.